Today we'll take a deeper dive into testing a React or Next.js app as we look at unit tests versus integration tests with Jest and the React Testing Library. Hello and welcome, I'm Dave. Today we will learn about testing an application with unit and integration tests using Jest and the React Testing Library. And I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. I'll also provide a link for you to join my Discord server where you can discuss web development with other students and you can ask questions that I can answer and receive help from other viewers too. I look forward to seeing you there. In the previous videos of this testing series, we've set up Jest and the React Testing Library, confirmed it was all working, and we've written a few simple unit tests. If you haven't watched those videos, I recommend you start there, and I will link to them in the description below. Specifically, you want to go through the Next.js testing video that helps you set everything up, because I will be using that today, but I won't be going back through the setup again in this video. The overall goal of today's lesson is to dive deeper into writing tests with the React Testing Library and talk about the difference between unit and integration tests. And while we won't cover everything that's possible today, I think I can give some good examples to help you begin testing your applications, and these examples should help you understand the documentation better as well. I'm providing the starter code that you see here for this lesson. You can download the repository from GitHub at the link in the description and ensure you have Node.js installed, and then when you open up the project in VS Code, open a terminal in the root folder and type npm install. And this will install all of the dependencies you need to run the project and run the tests, and it will be the same ones that I list here in my package.json, specifically all of these dev dependencies. And I want to point out this dependency in particular, the Jest DOM here for the testing library, because I'm not using the latest version. The latest version currently seems to have an issue with TypeScript types, and so I have rolled back to 5.16.5, and then the types are all correct, and hopefully that gets corrected in the future. So you may be watching this video and you won't have a problem with the latest version of this dependency. However, right now, I think you'll want this one because TypeScript will give you errors without one that, of course, recognizes the types. The application we'll be testing today is a simple to-do app, and I don't think you need me to review an entire to-do app, so we're not really concerned about writing the code for the app today. We're more concerned about looking at how the tests are structured for each component, and then how the tests are structured when we test all of the components together. Let's cover the types of tests, and you can see here I googled what is a unit test, and what comes up right away is an answer that says it's the smallest piece of code that can be logically isolated in a system, and we're going to test that. So isolated is important as we come back and write our unit tests for each component. So that is how we're looking at unit tests. We're isolating the component and then we're testing it without any outside dependencies. If we have those, we're going to learn how to create mock dependencies so we can just test that component in isolation. So what about integration tests or integration tests versus unit tests? Well, I googled that as well, and here's a good description. It says unit tests always take results from a single unit, such as a function call, but integration tests may aggregate results from various parts and sources. And there's no need to mock away parts of the application like we would with a unit test. And I was talking about that. Of course, we'll get into that. However, so the integration test, think about components working together. In our to-do list, we have a component where we can add a to-do, and then of course we see that new to-do in the to-do list, which is another component. So we're going to write an integration test to check how all of that works together. Now, one other type of test I wanted to bring up that you may have heard of is E2E, or end-to-end. And I actually think of this as beginning to end, because as they say here, a testing method that evaluates the entire application flow from start to finish. So if you think about this as a user of a website, you would go there, possibly create a login, and then log into the website, add some things to a cart, go through the checkout process, and then maybe log out. That's complete end-to-end testing. And we don't do that with unit tests and integration tests where we look at each piece or how they work together. So that's something we would do possibly in the future in another tutorial with Cypress or Puppeteer. Now quickly, before we start looking at code, I want to go to the React Testing Library site, or the testing-library.com site, actually, because it's available for more than just React. However, on this site, we're looking in the React section and at About Queries, and now I want to highlight the different types of tests we'll be writing when we write these unit tests first. And there is a get by, and they've got a chart here that says, okay, if nothing matches, it will throw an error. If we get one match, it's going to return the element. If there's more than one match, it's once again going to throw an error, and it's not async. And this is get by, which is a very common type of test. Now, if I'm looking for something that I think won't be on the page, I'm going to choose query by, because that returns null instead of throwing an error if there are 0 matches. And so that's typically when I reach for query by. Other than that, it's the same as above. Now, find by, very much like get by, except it's async. So we'll keep that in mind as well. Now, multiple elements. We also have get all by, query all by, and find all by. So they really are the same, except these methods are going to return arrays. And so we'll keep that in mind as well as we look at the code. I'm back in VS Code. Let's look at each individual component in our application. And you can see I've got the AddTodo folder open here. Let's also talk about the organization a little bit. And actually, I'll do that first. So see, we have a test directory with 2 underscores in front and 2 underscores behind. These directories will be defined automatically when we run our tests, and we can put test inside. Some choose to keep this outside of the source directory in a next project and then just put all of their tests in that one directory. However, you can organize it with the components, and that's what I've done here. So this directory that says tests is for the component that we have here in the page.tsx, and we'll come back to it. But right now, we want to look at each of these individual components. Notice that the nav bar is the only one I didn't create a separate folder for with my organization here, and that's because I didn't write any tests for it. It really just pulls in the header component, and I'm testing that separately. We could write a test to check to make sure it renders a nav element if we want to, and if you want to do that, that would be good practice. I'll leave that to you after we look at the test for the header component. Here is our header component, and you can see it receives a title as a prop, and then it's going to render that title in a header. So let's look at the test now. Notice there is another test directory inside of this header directory. And when we look at this, we could write a couple of tests to make sure it renders what we expect. So here we have it, and you could use this as test as well. Either would work. So some examples you may see test written, and some you may see it. I like it because it reads as a full sentence here. It should render the next to-dos heading. And notice now we're rendering the header component, and I'm passing in the title value of next to-dos. Then we actually get that on the page, and as in the previous tutorial, I've talked about the AAA pattern here. So we start by arranging, and that's when we render the actual component, and then we act, and here we're going to get that component where we have screen get by role. We're searching for the heading, and now we can specify here in the options the name, as it should be the heading that displays next to-dos. And we expect that header then to be in the document. And that's the third A, that's the assertion or assert. So we have arrange, act, and then assert. And then I essentially run the same test again with another value. I put my name in there, and we make sure that it works in the same way. So we didn't hard code in that value next to-dos, for example. So that's a very simple component with a couple of simple unit tests here, and that's what this is. It's testing in isolation. Notice we surrounded it with a describe that just said header, and we were just checking a couple of things as they would render on the page. So now let's move on to the next one, and let's start at the bottom with the to-do item. So as we look at our test for the to-do item, or we could look at the to-do item component as well, it's really fairly simple. So I've got an article parent here that should be returned and rendered. Then we have a label that has the to-do title in it. And then after that, we have a div surrounding the input, which is a checkbox, and that would toggle it as if it was complete or not, either true or false there. And then we have a button that should delete the to-do from the list as well. So that is our delete button. So now if we go to the test, let's look at how this is organized. And there's several things to note in this file. So notice we're importing render and screen, as I did in the previous tutorial. We wrote a few simple unit tests in that tutorial. I'm also bringing in the user event. Now this kind of simulates a user. It can actually trigger more than one event. So if you've watched other tutorials that have fire event, they're only triggering that one event. But actually using the user event is more like what you would see from a user. Now, no, this is not the same as end-to-end testing, but at the same time, it can uncover some things that might be unexpected otherwise. So using user event is a good idea. And then we're just bringing in that TodoItem component, of course. Now notice I've got a mock to-do here because we're testing this in isolation. And then I need a mock set to-dos as well because this component receives both the to-do and set to-dos that we see. So this mock set to-dos, you can use jest.fn, which stands for function, and that can just be a mock function. We're not really looking for how the set to-dos works, but we can confirm that it is called. So now let's look at our tests here. And I'm going to scroll up, and I'm also going to press Control B to hide the file tree, so we just have a little bit more room to see the code. Notice I've got a describe inside of a describe here. So first I'm describing the component as AddTodo, but then I've organized my tests within. So I have a render describe where I'm checking how things should render. And then as I scroll a little further down, I've got another describe on behavior, and this is how I expect some of the things in the component to behave. So let's quickly look at these renders. They're all very similar tests. So we should render an article, so we get that by role, just looking for an article element, and we expect it to be in the document. And then we also have render a label. Notice this is different because get by role will search for the actual element. We can't do that as easily with the label, so I have get by test ID. When you have a hard time finding something in a different way, you can apply a test ID, and I want to show you that in the component as well. So I'll bring the file tree back, go over here to the TodoItem. Notice I've got data-test ID, and then I set that to delete button on the button that we have inside of our component here. So that's how we are finding that with our test. Okay, back to the test. Now we see we looked for, well, actually this was the label with TodoItem. I did that for the button as well. Let me come back and highlight another test ID. Here we go. So Control Z, or no, that is Alt Z. Actually, I got that to wrap down so it wouldn't extend off the page. The data-test ID equals TodoItem on the label. That's the one I needed to find here, at least at first, and that's how we're finding that on the page. So I'm using that get by test ID and it's TodoItem. And then after that, we're just expecting it to be in the document. And the third small test for a render here is checking the checkbox. And we can get that by role. Each TodoItem just renders one checkbox, and we expect it to be in the document. Finally, should render a button. And here is the one that I was talking about before, but I actually, in this instance, I use get by role, and I'm just looking for the one button. Later on, when we look at the list and there's more than one button on the page, I'm going to need that test ID. So very simple render tests, and that's all in the describe block that's inside of the parent describe block we have up here for the component. So now let's look at the behavior tests. And I'll also hide the file tree once again. Now, the first one, it says, should call set to-dos when a checkbox or when checkbox clicked. So notice we're passing in our mock set to-dos, and we can test for that. So we find that checkbox, then we await the user event, and we click the checkbox. And then we can expect the mock set to-dos function to be called. And because we set that above with our jest function, we can check for that. And then we do the same thing down here, should call set to-dos when the button is clicked, because that will also happen when we delete a to-do. We'll filter out the one we're deleting and of course set the to-dos again. So very similar test, but instead of finding the checkbox, we're finding the button, and then the user is clicking the button with our user event here, and we're checking that to be called. And once again, this is all tested in isolation. Now I'm going to bring the tree back over, and after the to-do item, we could check the add to-do or the to-do list. Let's go ahead and look at the to-do list first and the tests inside. I think The to-do list is what you would probably expect in a to-do or a to-do application. And here you can see if there are no to-dos, we have no to-dos available. Otherwise, it's going to render the to-dos, and we're sorting them in reverse order here. So then when we map over sorted to-dos, we get the most recent one at the top that way. And I could press Alt-Z again to wrap that down, just so you can see here's our to-do item. So in a way, they're working together already when we're testing this, but I am not testing anything about the to-do item. We're going to focus on this to-do list. So once again, the to-do list receives the to-dos and set to-dos. So now I have an array of to-dos instead of an individual to-do, and this is mock to-dos. And then once again, I have the mock set to-dos here. Now I'm describing the to-do list. Let me hide that tree over there. And now it says, should render no to-dos available when the array is empty. Notice here I'm not using the mock to-dos. I'm just passing in an empty array because that's what we want to check in this specific test. And then I'm passing in mock set to-dos as it expects. Now we should get by text and find no to-dos available. That should be on the page, and we expect that message to be in the document. The next test should render a list with the correct number of items. And so now we're going to render the to-do list, and we're going to pass in the mock to-dos as well as the mock set to-dos. And then we're going to get all by role. This is the first time you've seen that. Remember, this returns an array. It's the get all right here. And so now we have an array, and we have the mock to-dos list set with just the 2 to-dos in it. So we should expect that to-dos array length to be 2, and that's our assertion. Now let's go to the last one. It should render the to-dos in the correct order. So we're making sure the new to-do is on top essentially, and we can check that by knowing something about our mock to-dos above. See, I'm looking for the get coffee here, and that is the second to-do. It has the ID of 2, but when it's rendered, it should be the first one. So when we run this test and we render our to-do list, the first item, we can use get all by test ID, and we're getting the to-do item, and then we're getting the first element in that array. So the first item should have the text content, and here it reads as expect to have text content, and we get coffee, and of course we have the coffee emojis as well. Now let's go back to the file tree once more and look at our last component that is going to focus on the unit test here, and this is our AddTodo. And as you might expect, it's a simple form, and we have a handle submit function that is going to call set to-dos inside of it. So here we're returning this, and let me hide that again so we can see more, but our return in our JSX is the form right here. It has a hidden label, and we don't really test for that, but we could. And probably should in the renders, but I didn't think of that before. But of course, if you don't have a label here, you'll get a warning about not having a label with an input. It's not really critical to the function, though. We're hiding it as well. So other than that, we have our input right here that's a text input, and we have our button right here that is the submit button for the form itself. So now let's go back and look at the tests for this. And of course, hide that file tree so we can see better. And once again, there are enough tests, I am breaking it into blocks. So after the describe, add to do, and notice this only receives the set to dos. It doesn't receive the actual to dos. And that's because anytime you have set to dos, if you don't need the to dos by themselves, if you only need them in the setter, you can reference that in that function that can pull up the previous to dos already. And that's just something about React. That's not specific to Jest or React Testing Library or even Next.js. That's just part of React. Okay, so inside of our AddTodo describe, then we have the render, and I scroll down a little further and we have behavior again. So let's quickly look at what should be rendered. After we render our component, we should be able to get that input, the text input, by looking for the placeholder text that it has, which is a new to-do, and we expect it to be in the document. We should also render a disabled submit button. It's important to note the disabled part of that. So that's what it should be in, or the button state when it's first rendered. And after we render the component, we get that button, and then we can expect the button to be disabled. Now this is kind of a 2-in-1 because we know it rendered the button and we know it's disabled. Scrolling down, let's look at our behavior tests. So we should be able to add text to the input. And after we render our component once again, now in our act, we have a couple of things here and then the assertion after. So we've got the input, we get it through that placeholder text once again. Then we use a user event. So here we are awaiting once again, and we have user event.type. And we're going to type into that input that we've found, and I'll just type, hey there. So we expect the input to have value, hey there. Now in the next test, it should enable the submit button when text is input. And I said enabled. Let me just say should enable the submit button. And so when text is added to that input, the submit button should then be enabled. And once again, we grab that. Once again, we type into the input, and then we get the button. And I'm using get by role, and then I'm looking for the button that has the name submit. It's displaying submit on the button. And then we expect that button to be enabled. After that, our next test said should empty the text input when submitted. So we go through these same steps again, but now we're going to click the button to submit the form, and then we expect the input to have a value that is an empty string instead. And finally, because mock set to-dos is passed into our component when it's rendered here, then we can go through everything once again and click the button, and we can expect mock set to-dos to be called. So I'll save my simple change, and now of course I'll go back to the tree. Now I just want to highlight, if I'm going too fast for anyone, that's because I've provided all the code. I didn't want to type out each test and have you go along that way. It's kind of boring to do. Honestly, not a whole lot of people like just writing tests. However, it's important that you learn about them, so I'm more or less providing the code as examples that will hopefully help you write tests for your applications in the future. Okay, now that we've looked at each individual component, let's look at the integration testing that we have for our main page here. And notice here in our main page, there's a couple of things I really need to highlight. One is I've just set this to use client. So it's essentially a React app as much as a Next.js app because everything's in the client. I made this a very simple to-do app. And when you set the parent component to use client, then you don't really need to do that for the child components, because if the parent is a client component, then all of its children will be. And as a matter of fact, TypeScript is going to complain if you go ahead and set something like your to-do list under here as a use client component. No, I don't. Notice I don't have that here at the top. And if I did, my app would still work, but I would get an error in the dev console, at least as things stand right now. And it would say something about serializable props not being passed in. And that's because, notice, it's receiving set to-dos. So it knows right away that the parent has to be a client, because you can only use a hook like use state in a client component. And if this is receiving a prop of set to-dos, then its parent has to be a client as well. But even if that wasn't the case, any child of a parent component that is a client component is going to also be a client component. So just highlighting that as well. Okay, back to the page.tsx. And now notice here, I didn't do an API call. I am just providing a few to-dos to start out with. And that's because in the next tutorial I create, we're going to mock an API and look at how to add that probably to this application, because that's the part here that's really kind of not real life. We've just started out with a few to-dos. You could add more, of course, or delete these, but normally you're going to have an API call and some CRUD operations, right? Create, read, update, and delete. We'll look at that next time around. But in this page, we're just providing some to-dos to start out. And this is going to be an integration test, because what we're doing here is really just pulling in the AddTodo component that we unit tested already and pulling in the to-do list. And of course, it pulls in the TodoItem component as well. So we're going to make sure all of those components work together as we look at the tests for our page.tsx, which I called home.test.tsx, because the component in the page.tsx, if we look up here at the top, is named home. Of course, Next.js has a page.tsx at every level as we would go through, and that's not what we want so much. If we had if other routing here for application, we would have a lot of page.tsx files. So you want to name them what you have named the function. So we'll go with home.test.tsx. Okay, let's look at this now, because this is much like what we were doing before, but we're just making sure everything works together. And remember, the integration testing said, okay, now you don't need to mock away set to-dos or mock away the actual to-do list. And that's true, but at the same time, you could mock an API like I'll be looking at in a future video. Now, that said, we're not passing anything into our home function either. We just render home. And so that's why we've got some to-dos already being created here in the page.tsx that we can work with as well. So now let me go back to the home test again. And the first one is it just should add a new to-do. Simple enough, right? We've done much of this before. We grab the input, we let the user type, we await that user event.type. And then we expect that value, my new to-do, to be in the input. So that's the first step. And then we act on that and we get the button, and then we await the user event where he clicks on the button. Then we expect the input to have an empty value because it should empty out afterwards as well. Finally, we get the data here because we await the screen. And now notice I'm not using a get by, I'm using a find by. And if you remember from that chart we looked at for React Testing Library, find by is async. So notice before we never had an await before the screen, but now we do. And now we can look for that my new to do because it would take just a little bit. We have to await that to actually be on the page, right? And then we just take, I named this data, but we expect our data to have text content that says my new to do. I'm going to scroll up, once again hide that file tree just so we can see this next test better. This should update a to-do. So we once again render the component. Now we need the checkbox. And here, since we're using TypeScript and working with a checkbox can be a little tricky. Notice I used an assertion here in TypeScript where I had get all by role because at this point now there's a checkbox on the screen for every to-do item that's in our list. And so we're getting that very first element. And then I'm using the TypeScript assertion as HTML input element. And that will allow TypeScript to be okay with you checking the checkbox.checked value. And I'm checking it here at first because it should be false at first. And if we look back at our component once again, I come down to the page.tsx, notice they're all false when we start out here with this data. So that's one thing we could test there. Maybe in the future that would be a little bit more difficult to test, but since we know what data we have, we're checking that and we expect it to be false at first, and then we're changing it. And here we're just awaiting that user event, clicking the checkbox. Is checkbox checked now truthy instead of falsy? And finally, let's see if it deletes a to-do. So once again, very similar, but not quite the same because now we're getting the button. Notice once again that I have get all by test ID, and I'm looking for that delete button ID now. And that's what I talked about earlier in the video where they all have the test ID delete button because there's more than one button on the page. And we also have a button to add a new to-do on the page, and we don't want to select that in this array either. So we just looked for the delete button ones. Then I get the first one in the array, and I await the user event where it clicks the button. And then I'm using the to-do text. And notice I have .not to be in the document. So at this point, we don't expect it to be in the document. So above, I used query by text instead. And that's because if we search for that at some point and it's not in the document, we could have an error. Now here at the beginning, it should be there. And query by text works much like get by text. But anytime I'm looking for something not to be in the document, I kind of reach for query by text when I'm writing my test. So there's the full integration test for our application where we checked all of the components together. And notice that I'm really using the same tools from React Testing Library that I did to write the individual unit tests where we tested each component in isolation. Now, I know there's much more to testing, but this will really help you get started looking at a very simple application like this. And next time around, I want to mock the API calls and check out those CRUD functions as well. Now, a couple of things I also want to note here about Next.js, especially the latest version of Next.js 13 with the app router. If you're looking at testing a component that has useRouter, that's fairly difficult right now, and we have to mock the next/navigation. I may create either a blog post or a video on that in the future. And then server actions are still, they're still experimental, either alpha or maybe they've moved up to beta. I think they're still alpha. And so if you try to test a server action right now, that's not going to work out either. But overall, this helps you test the basics of components. And next time we'll be looking at mocking those API calls. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection. And a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you. And thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.